Do you think bread is healthy? Can one be healthy and eat bread every day? In this video, I'm going to give you 9 tips to reduce the impact of white flour. In this context, I'm talking about white bread. Can diabetics eat bread? And those who have liver fat or high triglycerides, can they eat bread the same way? This is what we'll discuss in today's video. So there are 9 tips I want to share. So I'm setting a goal of 9,000 likes. In the last few videos, I forgot. You always demand, so go ahead and like this video so it can be shared. These are invaluable tips. Who doesn't love bread? Firstly, I want to make clear that these tips don't apply if you have celiac disease or are gluten intolerant or even have gluten sensitivity. If you eat bread and get diarrhea, you go to the bathroom, feel nauseous, feel like vomiting or sometimes even vomit. If you have allergic outbreaks, skin allergies because of gluten, then there's not much you can do. You'll really have to avoid bread completely. But it's a minority of the population who will have any degree of gluten sensitivity. And the first tip is about the quality of the bread. First, you have to analyze a few things, whether the bread you buy at the bakery or at the supermarket. Always, when possible, check the information. If this bread has added sugar, it won't be a good option. Why? Just from the flour, wheat flour, roughly half the composition of the bread is going to be carbohydrates. Carbohydrates, sugars. If there's more added sugar, then it will be a much worse food. You also have to check if this bread contains any hydrogenated oil. If it has a lot of sodium, the amount of fibers in the bread, and also if it contains a lot of saturated fats, not only for some oil, but sometimes people put some other ingredient to replace it and also greatly increase the amount of saturated fats. What's the problem? Because you're increasing the amount of calories too much and you're still putting in a bad fat source. In addition to the sugar, the carbohydrate in the bread, you are adding another ingredient, and then it is no longer an interesting mixture. So always look at the ingredients. Avoid the one I talked about. There's another one too, which is fructose syrup. If you have it in the composition, I strongly suggest you avoid it. And the second step for you to eat bread in a healthy way is first, take care of your metabolism. If you have any metabolic changes, such as having very high blood sugar levels or high triglycerides, you have fat in your liver. In this case, it is more worthwhile for you to stabilize the metabolic issue, improve the first blood sugar levels, and then think about adding a source of carbohydrate, primarily simple carbohydrates like bread. So there are patients who are diabetic, and I don't prohibit them from eating bread using these tips here. Quite the contrary, for those who like to eat bread at breakfast, dinner, or an afternoon snack, if you follow this tip, you'll see that in a healthy way you can eat your bread. Now, if you're in a phase where your blood sugar is very uncontrolled, then it's smart and it's also wise for you to avoid these sources first. I have videos where I say, for you to control your blood sugar levels, you should avoid white flour and avoid bread. So I'm referring to that situation here for you who got confused, okay? So in those cases, yes. But if your blood sugar is well controlled, you have ideal levels. Or if you don't have diabetes, your entire metabolism is optimized. For example, this afternoon I ate a roll. That's why I made this video. And the person who was with me, it was a friend, asked me, "Man, you're a doctor, you're eating bread, but I don't have any metabolic problems. When I metabolize this bread, I'm not going to make my blood sugar levels spike because my metabolism works well. So bread is not going to cause diabetes, that carbohydrate in bread." What causes diabetes, especially type 2 diabetes, is insulin resistance, mainly due to an increase in fatty tissue, adipose tissue, which insulin cannot act on. So in these cases, it is worth restricting the consumption of bread until this metabolic part improves. Now, if you have a well-functioning metabolism, you won't have any kind of problem from consuming bread. People say that bread is inflammatory. Bread causes a lot of problems. Then you will enter that first group, which are the gluten intolerant. Then you will have an increase in inflammation. But if you're not in the groups I've mentioned, there's no reason for you to restrict bread for fear that it's going to raise your blood sugar, or else afraid that you're going to get fat in your liver because of that. If your metabolism is working well, then everything is good. Tip number 2 is to look after your metabolism first and control any diseases you have. Tip number 3, give preference to whole grain breads with whole grams or multigrams. Why? These grams are fiber. They improve the digestion process, increase your satiety, improve it too, reducing the risk of you having bowel cancer, for example, and also give you more satiety. So the grains are interesting. It's worth remembering here that it's not because a loaf of bread is wholemeal that it's much healthier than white bread. Why? Because there are whole grain breads which have those ingredients that I was talking about earlier. There are many whole grain breads. If you look, you'll see they have added sugar, for example, which has bad fats. So, yes, generally they are healthier, but always remember to look at the labels and know all the ingredients of each bread. Number 4, beware of carbohydrate-free breads. Like, for example, ketogenic bread, there are several recipes, but why beware if it doesn't have sugars? And you have to remember that these breads that don't have carbohydrates, that don't use wheat flour, for example, they have a higher amount of fats, even if healthy fats. But they'll also have a higher amount of calories. And if you have a metabolic disease or are taking care of your health, then you need to consider the calories. It doesn't do any good to avoid carbs, be afraid of carbs, and then heavily increase the calories in your diet. So whenever you choose a recipe, you also have to see, besides the ingredients, the number of calories. If it has more calories than white bread, it's not worth it, because in the long run, it will cause harm and will also impact your blood sugar. Even though you notice when you eat a bread without carbs or a recipe without carbs, in the short term it won't increase, but in the long run, especially if it's more calorific, then yes, it will be worse. It's not worth this trade, no matter how good it sounds. Ah, keto bread. But be careful with these foods that seem very healthy but aren't for everyone. Tip number 5, use bread as a strategy. I'll cite my own case here again. You can see that I like a roll. What do? I like to eat bread, white, that roll that we buy at the bakery, but I have a strategy. I use it as a source of energy. I lift weights, I go to the gym, and just before, about 15-20 minutes before, I eat a roll. Why? Because I'm going to use this bread as a source of energy. This bread will not be stored in my liver, will not turn into triglycerides. For example, I'm not going to store this bread in my belly as fat. Why? I'm going to use it to lift weights. I'm going to use it as an energy source. Carbohydrates, sugars are a great source of energy. There's a study that made a comparison. It saw two groups, people who lifted weights and didn't consume carbohydrates beforehand, compared with people who did. Carbohydrate sources like bread, for example, and those who consumed bread and simple carbs before weightlifting, they typically had a superior performance than those who didn't. Why? You'll use it as a form of energy. Here in the city, a triathlon event is happening, swimming, cycling, and running. And these participants I was watching today, I was on the beach observing them. I didn't participate, but I was watching, and many were consuming bananas with sugar. You may be thinking, oh, but is it truly beneficial eating bananas with sugar? I've seen, including in several videos, people speaking negatively. But what's really the issue here? Why are they thin and healthy? Because they are using it to run this triathlon course that I mentioned, happening here in the city. Just the run is 42 kilometers. Do you think he'll store any of it, or will he use it as energy? They will use it as energy. So if you use this tactic of consuming right before doing an exercise, especially an intense one, like weightlifting or running, you'll utilize it as a form of energy. And I wanted to ask you, I've told you what I do. Now tell me, do you like to eat bread? What's your strategy? Do you use this strategy? These strategies, actually, that I'm talking about here, mostly before exercise, to use as energy, or have you completely cut it off so you don't really give it any? Let's go to tip number 6. And tip number 6, if you have any metabolic alterations, do the test, see what happens. If you don't try it, you'll never know the real impact on your body. For example, there are patients who are diabetic and have noticed just by eating bread, it increases a lot. So you're going to be in the group of those people who really, you're going to have to cut down on the amount a lot, aside from following the tips. You'll have to starve a bit. But there are also many that don't have a significant impact, who don't see a lot of difference, or even some who don't see any difference. I've already done the test. I always like to test what I talk about on this channel for me, for my metabolism. If I eat a loaf of bread, it doesn't increase significantly. So for me, it's fine because it's like I mentioned in this video. So whenever possible, if you have any changes, take the test and discover what happens to your body, to your organism, and with other foods as well. But here, as I'm talking specifically about bread, see what happens. Tip number 7 is avoid the excesses and also avoid combining with other sources of carbs. For example, if you eat bread and are having a coffee, you're not going to eat a cake, for instance, or other foods with flour or couscous or other refined sugars. You're not going to put sugar in your coffee. You're not going to eat other sources of carbohydrates. Take care of that. Since you're going to be loading up on sugar, on carbohydrates in the bread, be cautious and avoid other sources of carbohydrates. And tip number 8, this tip is one of the most important. It also makes the most difference in your health, is that if you're going to eat bread, add sources of protein, like for instance, shredded chicken, egg, a great combination, bread with egg, who likes? I also like bread with egg. I'm simply talking about what I like here in this video. So I really like bread with egg. Here's the suggestion: the egg won't increase your cholesterol. If you have high cholesterol, don't worry, it's also a source of protein. A white bread, for example, with 2 eggs is a great meal. You have a complete food and won't make an excess of sugars. Why? Because you're not going to add other sources. Like I mentioned, a classic example that people use is bread with jam. Then yes, you're making a combination that's not very healthy. Or bread with honey. Bread with honey is already food that has sugars, carbohydrates. If you add it, and if you don't have a good metabolism and aren't going to do a very intense activity, it's not going to be a good option for you. But bread with egg, bread with white cheese, for example, bread with ricotta, also is very good and healthy. It won't have a big impact on blood sugar level. Also, considering in terms of calories, a white bread or a slice of white bread with 2 eggs is far from a caloric meal, all right? So add a protein source to your bread. And tip number 9, if you're going to eat bread, don't add sources of bad fats, like for example, butter. You like to put the bread in the pan. Put butter, making the bread golden and moist. But beware, this can greatly harm you because it significantly increases the calories and it also adds a bad type of fat. Or bread with olive oil, bread with oil. Often when we go to restaurants, we get that bread that is drenched in olive oil. And this kind of bread, even if it's olive, a healthy fat, it will harm you because it's extremely caloric. So avoid adding fat. Or bread with lard. A lot of people eat it, especially in the countryside. This you should avoid. Remember that lard is a type of saturated fat that is not healthy for your heart or your metabolism. So be careful when you add something to bread. Oh, but am I going to eat bread without butter? Yes, you will manage. It's a matter of habit. It's worth it for you to cut out these fats, okay? From 0 to 10, what grade do you give this video? If it's 10, I'll make more videos like this. Also include how you eat bread, or if you don't, what city you're talking about, what part of the world this video has reached. Write it here and I'll send a hug to your city. Now I'll leave a suggestion for you to watch. It's a video where I discussed 7 warning signs for colon cancer. Did you see that I mentioned the role of fiber in reducing colon cancer? It has other interesting tips as well. I talk about tests there and mostly about warning signs and symptoms. Click here and you'll enjoy this video about colon cancer. Big hug till next time.